Detectives investigating the murder of a young father in Washington state have tracked their suspect to Florida, smack in the middle of hurricane season. But in the wake of a wild storm, he's disappeared. Left in his wake, the two women in his life, the mistress, a beauty queen who can get any man, and the wife who has to choose between giving him cover or giving him up. Again, here's Josh Mankiewicz.
In the days after two Whidbey Island detectives knocked on his door and accused him of murder, the man who had once performed under the name Buck Naked suddenly felt very exposed. Jean Huden says her husband was sure of only two things: the cops would be back, and he had no intention of ever wearing prison orange.
He told me he will never see me in a jumpsuit, meaning jail or prison clothes. He's like, no, he had every intention of killing himself before it came to that.
Which brings us back to that hurricane, Hurricane Charlie. Jean says that after the storm passed, Jim asked her to drive him to Miami. He told her he wanted to spend one last night alone, drinking and gambling in a casino there, before he committed suicide.
And I'd left him with about $4,000 or $5,000 on a bunch of pills, and he was going to go off and take himself out somewhere.
You were crying?
I was hysterical.
Was he crying?
Yes, he was. He was. And so I drove away thinking that was the last time I was ever going to see him, and that I would be getting a knock on the door with asking me to identify his body.
For weeks, Jean says she waited amid the ruins of her storm-ravaged home for word of Jim's fate. She assumed he was dead, and that's what she told the Whidbey Island cops when they called to follow up.
There were several messages on the machine, from them, and I called him back and I told him what would happen. It's like, well, now you've got your man, he's dead, and there you go, case is solved.
But shortly after telling the police that Jim had probably killed himself, the phone rang again. It was Greyhound Bus Lines in Houston, Texas.
They found a bag that was left on the bus with Jim's name on it, with a bottle of Crown Royal, his clothes, and a gun in it.
How long? When did you hear from him?
I got a phone call from my attorney saying that they had heard from Jim and that Jim was at a motel down in Houston.
The lawyer put Jean in touch with Jim and filled her in on his latest plan, a plan that could only succeed if Jean agreed to send Jim money.
His plan was to get across the border and go from there. And so I sent him yet more money and allowed him to, get out of the country.
Which wasn't at that point a crime, since there were no charges against Jim.
At this point, no.
And here's where our story takes another bizarre turn. While Jean Huden, the wife Jim had cheated on for years, was willing to stand by her man and help him escape to Mexico, police learned that Peggy Thomas, Jim Huden's lover and alleged accomplice, was now willing to give him up.
I'm not involved in that case.
In this interview with detectives, Peggy Thomas said that in a phone call shortly before he fled to Mexico, Jim had confessed to killing Russell Douglas.
He said, I'm sorry, I love you. I never meant for you to be involved in this, but I did it. I did it when I went for cigarettes. I said, it can't be. And he said, you know what? Just know that I love you. You're never going to see me or hear from me again.
With Jim gone and no evidence tying Peggy to the murder, the detectives asked the public's help in documenting the couple's movements in December 2003, when Russell Douglas was murdered.
We put out descriptions of the vehicle that they were driving. Just a few days after it hit the media, we got a phone call from the Doña Ana County Sheriff's Office in New Mexico saying someone had turned in as a firearm that they believed might have been used in a homicide on Whidbey Island.
Talk about luck.
Doesn't get any better than that.
The gun came from a former Las Vegas sheriff's deputy who'd recently retired to New Mexico. The deputy had known Jim Huden and Peggy Thomas in Las Vegas, and in October 2003, the deputy said Huden had come to his house and asked to be shown how to shoot the gun. According to the deputy, the next time he saw either Huden or the gun was in January 2004, when Jim Huden handed it to him in a paper bag and asked him to hold it for safekeeping.
We took the weapon for testing, and it was matched to the shell casing from the tracker and also matched to the slug that was pulled from Russell's brain.
The murder weapon.
That's the murder weapon.
And you have a guy telling you that Jim Huden gave it to him.
Right. Not just that Jim Huden gave it to him, but that he taught Jim Huden to fire the weapon, and that Jim Huden gave it back to him just a few days after the murder of Russell Douglas.
If you'd had that information before you went to Florida, you could have brought Jim Huden back in cuffs.
You bet.
Instead, now you've got the proof, and Jim Huden's nowhere to be found.
Right. We have all we need. Now we just need Jim.
Coming up, with Jim out of the picture, his lover, Peggy Thomas, meets a new man, a millionaire cowboy who's about to be taken for a wild ride.
I looked in her eyes and I mean, she is evil.